Good afternoon. Welcome to Norad. It's a great pleasure for us to welcome you all here in our building. It's a building which has a history that links to what we're talking about today, extractive industries. This used to be Norsk Hydro's building, which was the biggest aluminium producer in Norway and an early mover in renewable energy as well. My name is Stig Travik. I'm Director of Climate and Environment in Norad. It's a great pleasure today to have very distinguished guests with us. We have the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and former UNDP Administrator Helen with us. We have Mark Robinson from EITI. And we have Nargis Nehan from Afghanistan, former minister. And I actually knew Nargis a long time ago, also as a former treasury in the Ministry of Finance, some 19 years ago. We won't have time to talk about that. Just one practical information. You can see the emergency exit behind you. If you need to go out quickly, go up the stairs and to the right and out of the building. Without much further ado, I would like to introduce our very own State Secretary of the International Development, Bjørg Sandkjær. She's going to give the welcoming remarks today and get us started on today's important program. Bjørg, welcome.
Thank you very much, Stig. Honorable Helen Clark, Minister Nargis Nehan, friends from EITI, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you all to this EITI seminar on Afghanistan and the role of extractive governance on stability or instability and peace. This is a very timely topic, given the relevance of extractives governance in this time of increased international instability, pressure on commodities, markets, and rising food and energy prices. Norway has over many years been a strong supporter, both as an implementing country and through our political and financial support to the implementation of EITI implementation globally. And I'd like to add that I used to work at Norad, and we had a great pleasure of having EITI as good neighbors down the corridor. It's a testimony to good collaboration at every level. And we see EITI as a tool for promoting transparency and good governance in extractive industries. Transparency is of fundamental importance in the global efforts to combat corruption. Fragile states have been important priorities in Norway's foreign policy over several years. We have continuously expanded our toolbox to improve stability and governance in fragile states. Afghanistan is an illustrative case of the complicated nexus between resource extraction and stability and peace. Afghanistan's abundant mineral deposits have through many years been seen as a means towards a more sustainable economy and to reduce aid dependence. But after the takeover by the Taliban last year, there are deep international concerns about the willingness of Afghanistan's government to adhere to international standards and obligations. Norway shares these concerns. We also hear the message from many Afghans that the Taliban government must respect basic human rights of all Afghans and move towards more inclusive governance. We do play an active role in communicating this message directly to the Taliban in Afghanistan. There is a need for constructive steps by the Taliban to address the concerns of many Afghans and the international community. Such steps may pave the way towards foreign investment and international cooperation on governance issues, including on resource governance. We know from various examples across the globe that there are actors willing to invest in extraction without adhering to international standards, and with very negative human and social consequences from those investments. It's our hope that the collective efforts of the international community find ways to avoid the deep risks involved in this sector and strengthen opportunities for fragile states. To do this, we need to actively seek to understand each context on its own terms, learn from each other and from the many ongoing and sometimes fragmented efforts across the world. So once again, I very much welcome this timely seminar as an excellent opportunity to do just that. Thank you. And with that, I hand over to, is it Mark, the moderator?
Many thanks, State Secretary Bankier, and to Stig Darvik from Norad for the very warm welcome today. I'm Mark Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the EITI based here in Oslo. Thank you for those who've joined us today in person. We have another 130 online, so that makes it a good number being participants in this important event. For those of you who don't know our series of Transparency Matters, this is a seminar and until recently, a webinar online series of addressing matters of topical importance in extractives governance. It started out life in Oslo, very much for us to communicate and engage with a policy and practitioner audience in Norway, but has since actually become much more global in its focus. So it's rather nice that we're back in Oslo talking to a largely Norway-based group in person, but of course to a much wider group of people externally. So today we are looking at a very particular and important case study of a country which had a really honorable history of engagement in the EITI before the Taliban took over last year, making enormous strides in improving transparency and governance in a critical sector of minerals. Much of that under the stewardship of Nargis Nehan with us today, who was the then Minister of Mines and Minerals. So it was a very important set of contributions made, which sadly have been brought to a standstill, hopefully for a short period until we can once again resume. And as you heard, we're joined by the EITI's board chair, Helen, who has been in that role for 3 years, but has enormous experience of working on a broader range of governance issues, and in particular on those issues as they play out in fragile and conflict-affected states. So I'm going to put a number of questions to Helen and Nargis now in conversation. I believe there's a way of me receiving other questions online from participants, so I look forward to seeing your contributions too. So if I might, with the first question, how does the role of extractives shape fragile and conflict-affected states?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, State Secretary, for your warm welcome and our time at NORAD today. Can I also acknowledge the Ambassador of Indonesia? Indonesia, of course, a long-time member of the EITI as well, and wonderful to be on the panel with Nargis. I was reflecting the first time I went to Afghanistan, which was in a time of more hope. It was late 2003. Apart from Kabul, I went to Bamiyan. I've been back a couple of times since, but we all grieve for what has happened to your country, and we know that under your leadership and supported by the President, Afghanistan was really making the most of the EITI to try to get its extractive sector, on a better basis, and we just hope that the opportunity for that will come again. How or when, who knows? But we live in hope of more positive developments. So when we talk about fragile and conflict-affected states, obviously we're talking about quite a large number of countries who experience, if you like, a nexus of challenges. One of those challenges is poor governance, which rubs off on extractives sector, usually accompanied by high levels of extreme poverty, so often accompanied by a very high level of exposure to adverse events, among which, of course, are extreme climatic events, which are worsening with the climate crisis. But often also these countries have tremendous riches if they could be used for the benefit of the people and not for private benefit or illicit financial gain. So, extractives can be a driver of something very good for human development and sustainable development of the country, but they can also be a driver of conflict as well. And to get on the right side of the ledger, you need at least a space with even a fragile peace so that these kinds of processes can kick in as they did in Afghanistan in the period between the fall of the Taliban and, tragically, its return. EITI has, among its membership, quite a number of states who would be defined as fragile, but we like to think that the work that we do to support local stakeholders, remember we're always a triangle of interest, we have government, we have industry, we have civil society, to support those stakeholders to drive forward the processes that will improve transparency, disclosure, knowledge of revenue flows, et cetera, so that the resources do act for the people. And if countries can take advantage of that space of peace, actually getting extractive sector governance right will reinforce building greater stability. I think to see a state go from failed state even to fragile state can be an achievement. We can be part of that journey and then lifting towards more stability. So back to you, Mark.
I might ask you a follow-up question, if I could. Sort of a more positive gloss is those states that have managed their resources well, are there lessons that can be learned from them for those which are facing some of the challenges you've just outlined, those which are rich in natural resources?
Well, it's all about governance, isn't it? So, and here we are sitting with our hosts in Norway, who've had tremendous bonanza from extractives and haven't squandered it. It's gone to sovereign wealth fund. One day those resources won't roll. Who knows when that day will be, but there will be a post-all Norway. But it will be a Norway with tremendous resources to draw on in its highly developed human capital, its infrastructure, the ability to be thinking now about other sectors of economic activities to sustain it going forward. Across the ditch, as we say from New Zealand, across the Tasman Sea, we have Australia, which has the most extraordinary bounty of mineral resources. Again, a high-income country which has benefited a lot. Canada would be another example. So then looking at developments in a number of developing countries who have looked at some of these examples and some of the best practice that EITI can convey, we saw Timor-Leste set up a sovereign wealth fund. Now, there'll always be debate about how much of a sovereign wealth fund you spend and how much you save. And I think the rule of thumb for a developing country would be invest a third for the long term, put a third into infrastructure, and put a third into boosting the human development now. It's probably a completely different equation from Norway, which had the boosted human development. But I don't think it would be sustainable in a country coming off low-income status not to spend some of it for human development, to give that boost to human capital. Ghana, sort of relatively late entrant to oil exploration, also went down the sovereign wealth fund route. So I think there are some good lessons and precedents.
Yes, I think it's really important to emphasize one of the reasons that EITI is here in Oslo for these very reasons, is to promote lesson learning for others who are members of the EITI who want to learn from those positive examples that we've just heard. So Nargis, if I might, for you, address a question. What role have extractives played in Afghanistan's economy? And to what extent do you think that resource abundance contributed to conflict and political instability?
Well, thank you very much. Before getting to your question, Madam Secretary, Madam Clerk, Mark, Ambassador of Indonesia, Stig, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to all of you. I also have to express my gratitude to EITI Secretariat and as well as Norad Foundation for arranging this very engaging and important discussion and providing me the platform to share my perspective with two very prominent women in today's discussion. I feel humbled and grateful. And having three women, especially one from Afghanistan, talking about management of natural resources speaks volumes about women's progress and participation in highly male-dominated sectors such as extractive industries, which is so vital and important for open and inclusive government. Reversal of all this progress in Afghanistan, stripping away all human rights of Afghan women by the Taliban, silence of the world in this 21st century when the technology is bringing us so close that we literally are living in a house with each other, that close, is another tragedy, quite historic, that I think we need to discuss another platform. Now, coming back to your question, Mark, that you talked about EITI, as you very rightly mentioned, Afghanistan is blessed with natural resources. The beautiful land of Afghanistan, all the mountains that we have, are all having these diverse mineral and natural resources that can really help Afghanistan with recovery from the conflict and as well as from the development. And as you know very well, that the United States Geological Survey estimated the basic value of the natural resource of Afghanistan to be around $1 trillion. Now that is only the basic estimate. When we are going for the extraction, for processing, for export, this whole value chain is bringing a lot of opportunities and development for Afghanistan, of course, if they are managed and governed properly. However, what do we do with all these resources when today 90% of Afghans are living in poverty and more than 60% of our children are in malnutrition? Our families are selling their girls, their children, and literally their kidneys to be able to bring food on the table. That is our situation today. So unfortunately, in case of Afghanistan, the natural resources that we have contributed more to conflict and stability than development of Afghanistan. Contribution of the natural resources and extractive industries to our GDP is very much minimum and close to insignificant. Although we have tried hard and we tried to help the situation, especially with support of colleagues from EITI, but you know that Afghanistan has been in conflict for 4 decades. So there are a lot of challenges that we're facing. I just want to highlight a few of them and then how we try to address them with the support of EITI in Afghanistan. First of all, Afghanistan is a landlocked country, so the infrastructure is very poor. The insecurity was very high, especially before 15 August. Unfortunately, corruption and the illegal mining that was happening, especially by the Taliban and even by the ISS for financing their activities, was some of the major challenges that we were facing as a state, not only Ministry of Mines and Petroleum. And to be able to counter those challenges, we needed to have an approach from the government, from the whole state, not only from Ministry of Mines and Petroleum. But then there are also challenges at the institution level that you're having it. We had the weak governance, lack of leadership, lack of system, corruption, very complicated bureaucracy, and very weak legal framework that was actually discouraging and making investment in the mining sector very, very complicated. And then we didn't have any incentive for investors to come invest in Afghanistan. That is because we in Afghanistan were not still used to working with the private sector, with the investors, and making Afghanistan, like an interesting country for them to and providing with an incentive to come and invest in Afghanistan. We had this impression that Afghanistan is having a high mineral resources, and we have world like US coming, and because of our mineral resource for Afghanistan, I mean, we don't need to invite investors. They are coming themselves to Afghanistan. So I think culturally we had to do a lot of work to make everybody realize that no, like having political engagement is one thing, but bringing investors to the country is another thing. So those were the challenges that we were facing in Afghanistan. At least for 2.5 years that I served between 2017 to end of 2019 Afghanistan, I tried to change things, the culture of governance and making things open in the sector, so that at least we can get to move towards reform of the sector. I'll give you a couple of the examples that we try to reform the sector. So first of all, we came up with the mining sector roadmap to have a clarity for ourselves, for our partners, for the private sector, that how we are going to develop the sector and how we're expecting everybody to play the role that they are required to play in the process. We also came with a reform strategy that for Ministry of Mines and Petroleum, as a responsible institution for management of sector, what kind of capacity we need and we require, what are the gaps and how we can fill those gaps. Well, we also developed the minerals and hydrocarbon law and regulations, so at least we can provide a reliable legal framework for the investors and as well as for the ministry to be able to operate and reform the sector. At the institution level, we try to establish the Afghanistan Oil and Gas Regulatory Authority so that we can have a division of roles and responsibility between ministry as a policymaker and the AGRA as regulatory authority. The Mining Technical Committee was another independent body to be able to regulate the sector. We tried to set them up. We also managed to computerize the whole cadastre system, and we linked that with a transparency portal that anybody could go and that they could get any information that they required in terms of mining contracts, in terms of extraction, import, export, everything. And we managed to put all mining contracts that were signed in the last 10 years in that system so that anybody could go and they could review those contracts for public scrutiny. We also signed several memorandum of understandings with civil society groups and encouraged them that they can get engaged with the ministry and they can begin to monitor the sector and provide their feedback and recommendations for us for development and reform of the sector. Professionalization of the ministry was in our high priority, and thanks to all the scholarship that different countries provided to the young generation of Afghanistan in the last 20 years, we had a very good number of Afghans that they had studied in the mining sector, and the economic sector, and development sector, that for different departments, we managed to bring all of them on board, that they knew the language of the world, they knew the technology, so they knew very well how to operate and develop the ministry. And of course, we also had to review a lot of pending previous contracts to be able to resolve their issues and move them forward. These were some of the highlights that actually we managed to do. But of course, this journey was not easy. It was very challenging. First of all, because Afghanistan is a country that is still sinking in corruption, unfortunately. And on top of that, I was a woman. And it was very difficult for men to see a woman leading reform of a sector and expecting all of them to work like more transparently. So of course, left and right, they were trying to create problem, and I kept on fighting with them until I could. But after 2.5 years, when I felt that, okay, the environment is not there and there is not appetite for reform of the sector anymore, I thought it's better that I step back, and I was hoping that my predecessors will take forward what I started with. But of course, challenges was a lot, especially after signing of the peace deal with the Taliban.
Thank you so much for such a comprehensive response, and it's striking how much was achieved under your relatively short period as Minister on this agenda.
Maybe coming in with a supplementary question to Nargis. What are you hearing about the institutional legacy that you left? Does anyone care? Has it fallen apart? Is there any ongoing work?
So, interestingly, 3 very different updates that I'm still in contact with people. First of all, the leadership that in the Ministry of Mines now from the Taliban side are very interested to establish contact with me. And somehow see that, like always from time to time, they send me messages and they tell me that we respect you and we heard a lot about you. And we found you as one of the very few cabinet members that literally we haven't found anything against you so far in terms of corruption, because I was so much for transparency coming from the civil society. But I'm kind of politely telling them that yes, but you don't recognize women. You don't see us as your equals. I said, the day that you respect women, I tell you that I'm going to come and help you without asking for anything. But at least first recognize me as a woman, that I was there, and the sector that you're managing today and the desk that you're setting was actually purchased when I was in the ministry. And I was talking to them when they were sitting in the meeting room, which was actually furbished when I was in charge of the ministry. In terms of private sector, I'm part of several working groups that we are discussing. There are unfortunately very negative progress, especially because of the sanctions that Taliban are facing. They are turning to natural resources, and they have expedited giving a lot of small-scale mining contracts and expediting and expanding the export. of especially coal and marble, talc, and other commodities which could easily be extracted and exported. So most of their income are coming from the extractive industries. The good thing that I'm hearing is that Taliban, though they have taken different ministries, including the Ministry of Mines and Petroleum, but when you're going down lower than the deputy minister level, at the civil servant level, you still have all the old stuff that they're trying to, and then they know that they don't have the capacity, so they're not trying to remove all the bureaucracy and like procedures that you have in place. They're trying to see and understand things and see that how they can use all those things for their benefit. So the system that we have, the computerized system, is still there, and some of the young generations are still working, and they're trying to do the things, and they're still trying to work on the laws and on the regulations. And when they are in contact with them, I just tell them that hold on there. I'm sure the day will come that we can come back and we can take like things from where we left them there. So the good thing is that they are not reversing and trying to destroy everything.
Thank you. Helen, another question for you. How do you think in-country institutions build resilience to effectively manage the development of the extractive sector? And what role do you think the EITI governance framework might play in that?
Well, I think Nargis actually set out quite clearly how you start that process of building an institutional framework to manage these resources, and she also referred to the importance of the legal framework and the regulatory framework. So these are all, very, very basic steps, it seems to me. Now, I think where EITI is also important is because it's based on a sort of concept of partnership between government, civil society, and private sector. It's part of building trust in institutions and processes. And if that actually isn't working very well, you'll find civil society in a country will be a voice for, EITI taking some kind of measure because it doesn't see the processes as productive. But trust is in the institutional framework being developed is extremely important, because where you again can see a lot of conflict arise, and including social conflicts, is where people feel there's things going on in the sector that we don't know about and or we certainly don't approve of. And looking at our Latin American director, Francisco, here, I'm mindful of going to Peru and hearing the ministry telling us how many social conflicts there were ongoing in issues over extractives in that country. And it's not obviously far from being the only country where these social conflicts are arising, because you may have indigenous people who feel very threatened by the prospect of the mining company coming in, small communities seeing the possibility for impact on their water supply, their landscape and their catchment and so on. So, getting transparency about what's happening, what licenses, what's the deal, what are the payments, what's the mitigation, what's the ongoing revenue flow, how's it going to be used. EITI is a generator of a lot of information about all of these things. And the concept is that citizens ought to be able to follow the money. If you're a subnational jurisdiction which is receiving money from the National Treasury as part of your share for royalties or payments extracted, then where did the money go in this area? I also think of a conversation with a subnational government that we had on a mission when one could do missions pre-pandemic, with the representatives of the regional government saying, we had these subnational flows coming in here for years, but where did it go? We haven't got a legacy from it. So, information coming through multi-stakeholder processes should start these kinds of debates. Where did the money go? Could we plan better? So a lot of this, of course, depends on supporting civil society capacity. We do rely on civil society to hold governments to account, the whole sector to account. And civil society is often undercapacitated. And let's face it, there are also a range of governments which get very anti about international support for civil society. you know, they sort of curtain off whole areas of work like transparency, human rights, gender, and so on, where they don't want foreign assistance, as it were. So it can be really tough for civil society. But to do its job, it needs to be capacitated. It needs its analysts. It's more than just voice. It's about informed voice, so that you can carry out your responsibilities to society and community. So there's a lot of different things involved in getting this right. But I think, Nargis, the systematic way you were going about it is very encouraging. We hope the chance comes again. And looking around the EITI family, you see very serious multi-stakeholder groups in country, all trying to nudge their country forward and to the extent that they can in the context they have. So.
We heard a lot about the situation regarding Extractives governance in Afghanistan and some of the efforts that you are making. And Helen was referring to other countries, many of them members of EITI, rich in natural resources, but also facing challenges around conflict and political instability. Stepping back, what sort of wider lessons do you see coming out of Afghanistan's experience for others to learn from in this regard?
In terms of engagement with the EITI.
And in terms of how to manage natural resources in a way that minimizes the risk of conflict.
Okay. Well, I think the good thing is that we are so connected today that social media and all these platforms are providing us tremendous opportunity in terms of information sharing. So a corrupt deal could have been hidden for years previously. That could be exposed in hours now. So I think building up on all these platforms is really important in terms of information sharing. Because those that they are against transparency, they have something that they want to hide. Those that they're for transparency, they are not fair of sharing information. So we need to understand and we need to promote that awareness. And I think it's also the matter of culture. As Helen, you very rightly mentioned about multi-stakeholders engagement. One thing I do know that since I was coming from the civil society, I was always making sure and encouraging them that they come to the meeting. My dilemma was actually different. The civil society mostly was not taking any interest in the mining sector because first, the sector was not that developed, so there were not a lot. And secondly, there was not any support for their engagement in the sector. And then Afghanistan was so much focused on the peace development, especially the peace process, that all those well-informed and civil societies with good capacity were focusing on the peace process, good governance, all those things. So when I was inviting them, literally I had to call most of the directors myself that I have this meeting today, you guys need to show up, otherwise you know that I'll get upset. That is how I was getting civil society to the table in discussions and telling them that you need to contribute. And I kept on telling them that, look, you have this opportunity today that you have me, but you will not have me definitely tomorrow here. I want to make sure that the doors and windows of these ministries are open for the civil society, and we should strengthen that in a way that nobody should be able to close it when I leave. So I think that engagement is really important, and also giving the sense to the private sector and as well as to the civil society that basically ministry's job is to facilitate development of this sector. We don't own this sector. The problem that we usually have in countries like Afghanistan, especially those that they're working in the system, they think they own everything. So they can come up with their policies, with their procedure, they are the controllers, and they are very much loyal and committed to the sector, especially the private sector is not. So you need to do a lot of awareness raising and trust building between different stakeholders that we have to work together for development of the sector. There were times I remember that we were having some contract negotiations, and I was standing myself and going all the way to the gate to welcome the investors and bring them, because I wanted to demonstrate to my colleagues that you just cannot treat the investors as if you're a visitor. You're coming and you're doing your job. You need to understand that you're equal partners. You're working here for a salary, but they come and they invest their money in the sector. So they're more committed to the sector. So I think that kind of trust building is really important in terms of conflict. The other thing is that for development of the sector, we should really understand the dynamics of every country. What dynamics in terms of conflict do they have? And what are the source and triggers of the conflict? Yeah. For example, in case of Afghanistan, you're having mainly in a conflict because of the proxy war waged by our neighboring countries. Secondly, because of the lack of proper state institutions that we have inside Afghanistan. Thirdly, because of the very fragmented social fabric and ethnical tensions that we have. So if you don't take these into account that, okay, how we are going to deal with Pakistan when you're, or Iran when we are developing the sector, because we are a landlocked country. End of the day, if you want to develop the sector, we should be able to find one way to collaborate with this country or the other way, even if you're not politically getting along with them. Thirdly, what kind of governance structure we need to put in place that all ethnicities would see that, okay, it represents them. It's going to serve all of them. And then thirdly, how are you going to deal with the situation when most of the natural resources of Afghanistan are in the north of Afghanistan and people are thinking that they have more sense of entitled, but they're not getting out of it? So you need to come up with a mechanism that you have to pay some amount of that money back to the communities. You help them with the development. You come up with these mechanisms so that they allow everything to happen and they don't get into illegal mining. Because the more they feel that sense of lack of ownership, the more they will be supporting illegal mining because they can get easy income directly to them, and then they're like, why should I care about proper development of the sector? So I think that conversation should continuously happen, especially with local players.
That's so hugely relevant in many countries in which the EITI is present. So those have much wider relevance as lessons from Afghanistan. And I'm going to ask you a short final question before we open it up for questions from the floor. Is what role do you think that international organizations like the EITI, UNDP, the European Union, or indeed bilateral donors like Norad can play in mitigating risks and supporting opportunities for fragile states that are resource-rich?
The first comment I'd make is feeding off Nargis's reference to the term landlocked developing countries, because they face a particular set of challenges. But also, if peace can be obtained, a particular set of opportunities. And I've heard Ashraf Ghani expound in his office to me and to others, what the vision for Afghanistan at peace could be. It could be a vital hub of trade and commerce. It's the old Silk Road concept, really, isn't it? The elusive thing is getting the peace, and one would like to think that good governance, including in the extractive sector, would be a pathway to that. But yeah, there are special needs for a country in the situation Afghanistan's in with the geographical status. So coming back to the role of the international partners, and of course Norway, very important international partner, and the international institutions, I think EITI has a particular niche. It's not a UN organization, but it most definitely is an intergovernmental and multi-partner organization with a standard, which I always liken to a convention in international law. And to come into the initiative as an implementing country, you need to be validated against the standard. And so that is the incentive for starting down this road of improving governance, of meeting the requirements for disclosure, of having the adequate legal framework, including now in company contract disclosure and openness, beneficial ownership, et cetera, et cetera. So making progress against the standard, and believe me, it's a little bit like going before a universal periodic review at the Human Rights Council. I've been involved with a number of countries through UNDP in the past where they would come back from the Human Rights Council peer review process with at least a couple of hundred recommendations for action. Well, it's not unknown for a validation process for EITI to have dozens of recommendations for action, which need to have progress shown against them by the time of the next validation. So this is all supportive of a process of working to a higher standard of governance. Now, one of the key issues in that validation process is the civil society space. And it's on this criterion that a number of countries have gotten to some degree, because if those associated with the EITI processes are not able to work openly, freely, and fairly and speak their minds. This is very damaging for the process, because what are we about? We're about transparency, we're about disclosure of information, we're about public debate and dialogue on what's happening to the resources and the revenue flows from them. So, you know, if people start getting, you know, shot, attacked, assaulted, disappeared, this is obviously a very, very significant worry, and it does happen, and EITI will act on serious infringement of civil society space.
Thank you. That's really insightful. I've got 6 questions already in front of me. So as you think about your questions, first of all, I'm going to pose them to our panelists and ask you to give very brief answers to these. For you, Nargis, how has the EITI effort in Afghanistan generated meaningful results? And secondly, what should we do as the EITI International Secretariat in terms of our current responsibility for Afghanistan? Continue to engage or step away? So those are your questions. And I'm going to ask Helen's now, so you can be thinking about your...
Yeah.
All right, in that case.
Well, I think EITI can play a catalyst role, providing the support and protection for those that they want to develop the sector. Because countries like Afghanistan, where you have corruption, you have illegal armed groups, you have so many different groups that all of them are having their interest in the sector, they are very strong. And they know the institution and they know the sector for now 20 years, 4 decades, maybe a century. So for them, like, they know in and out everything. So they know very well how to play the whole politics. They are very well connected. Suddenly, what I saw, for example, when I went to the sector, I at some point realized that all those people that they were not open for partnership and development of the sector in the private sector, some in the civil society, they were very well connected with parliamentarians, they were very well connected with Ministry of Finance, they were very well connected with Ministry of Interior. And at some point, I felt that I, with a small number of my colleagues, are so small in comparison to the whole network that you have, which has been operating for decades now. And they're so much institutionalized in our system. So to be able to break that vicious cycle and to be able to start the reform process, it's very important that EITI develop a mechanism that how do you identify the reformers? And then how you're supporting and at least finding ways to protect them so that they can dare to go into that sector and begin the reform process and then be able to maintain them. For example, I'll give you an example. When I was meeting the parliamentarians, which I shouldn't have, but everybody told me that you have to meet them and you have to promise some contracts and some money so that they can give you vote. I went and I explained all my programs to them, but I said, other than that, I cannot promise you any contract or money. First, because I don't have money. Secondly, I will not give you any contract, especially it's the matter of conflict of interest. So literally, 12 candidates went to Parliament for getting a vote of confidence. 11 of them, men from different sectors, managed to get all votes except me. And the reason that happened, because they knew that if she is in this sector, and she's not going to allow us to continue all these activities, especially that they saw in 6 months that I issued so many warnings and I had so many meetings. But then I had a meeting with the president, and then he told me, do you want me to offer you another job? It's better for you to move, or what do you think? I said, we are in a dilemma. If I go to another sector, it's much more easier for me, and I appreciate it. But we are also setting the precedent for these mafias, that whoever would come, try to reform the sector, they can get rid of them. And then the next person would come, the next person will never dare to start the reform because they know that it will be against their interests and they're going to beaten up the way that I was beaten up. And then I managed to convince him. He said, okay, it's better for you to stay for some time because we have to indirectly show them that we want to move ahead with the reform. But till that time, our relation was good politically. There was not any kind of fall apart. So I think protection and recognition and protection of reforms are really important. Understanding the difference of the culture and in each country. For example, even in case of Afghanistan, sometimes you're dealing with a civil society, but end of the day, you would see that civil society is literally part of the system that would not report to you properly. So I think understanding those different groups, actors, the way that they are operating and playing, and how we can find the right partners to partner up, to collaborate with, is really important. And then continuation of support for the civil society. As I mentioned, I so many times approached all these civil society groups and organizations, except GIZ and some support from EITI. There was not any other donor with any interest to support the civil society to actually get engaged in the sector. So that was our difficult. Now, coming at this situation, I highly recommend that the EITI at least identify some groups, the civil society, and begin to get engaged with them. A lot of illegal mining is happening in Panjshir, Badakhshan, and some other northern provinces of Afghanistan, and western provinces, and as well as eastern provinces, where you have talc, marble, coal, and all these easy to extract commodities. They are illegally being exported to Pakistan and Iran, and then from there all the way to China. So in terms of EITI, please help civil society so that at least they can document and they can prepare a report on what is happening in the extractive sector in Afghanistan and how it's actually supporting even the current internal and as well as regional conflict in Afghanistan. And then thirdly, accountability of the countries as a region is really important. EITI, we are your Afghanistan, one country is your member. You are having your set of benchmarks that we are actually developing the sector, and based on those benchmarks, you keep on monitoring that. There should also be benchmarks that would actually put accountability indicators for the countries that they're actually supporting illegal mining and illegal export and import of mining. For example, in case of landlocked country, we have to go through another country in terms of export of our commodity. But what do we do with those countries if they're supporting illegal mining, the legal mining? I think that is where you can play a catalyst role, that you can come up with some benchmarks that you can see which countries are supporting, and then you can put some pressure on them, especially through the international community and the donors, that they stop and prevent illegal mining. And at the country level, if we have that kind of collaboration, for example, in case of Afghanistan, if we have that collaboration with Iran and with Pakistan, I'm sure 80% of illegal mining would be prevented, is preventable.
About the risks around cross-border trade, but you're clearly ahead of your time when you talked about facing down politicians expecting contracts. Now that we have full contract disclosure of one of the EITI requirements, that would have made your job a lot easier, I suspect, than it was in those early days. And Helen, for you, a question, again, from those who registered for the event. How can fragile but resource-rich states survive and, dare I say, thrive in view of the global energy transition?
Well, I think for the fragile states, which have a bounty of mineral resources like Afghanistan, their hour has come, in a sense, if they can get governance of the sector right and clamp down on the sorts of activities that Nargis was just talking about. That the danger is that the rush for the key minerals needed to drive the energy transition will fuel more illicit activity, more conflict. So I think that for countries with these bounties, EITI membership and support from the international financial institutions for the sort of reinforcing the work that we do on good governance is going to be incredibly important. I mean, countries which will also experience challenges from the transition are those which have been looking to a boost to their finances from oil and gas extraction and a relatively late entrance. And as the energy transition accelerates, as it probably will, there will be expectations that are not met. That in turn could be quite disruptive. So that's one of the reasons we have got very involved in the energy transition sensitization, if you like, so that countries can start to assess the risk they are facing to future revenue flows and opportunities. But the other side of the ledger is those who will have a boost, but it could all go horribly wrong if the governance isn't right. So I think we have quite a useful role to play in this at the moment.
I'm looking to my team here, but I think we might have a few extra minutes since we started late. So I would like to take a couple of questions from the floor in this room. Do I see anyone who wants to come in?
Well, I think a process like this ideally should be a catalyst for the emergence of civil society. And the space may be very small, but, you know, just sort of nibbling away at working to expand it. I mean, EITI does require a multi-stakeholder approach unless there's an agreement to adapted implementation, which isn't very common in this space. So that's how I would see it. You know, when I was at UNDP, often, you know, you would sit in a very authoritarian country with civil society, and that civil society depended so much on international organizations and initiatives like this to be helping to open up space for being able to have voice and a say. So in this sense, I think EITI in itself is a catalytic initiative in endeavoring to create and open space. And from that, you know, one would hope to see that space benefit other sectors of society as well. It's not easy, and I'm very familiar with the Tajik context, having interacted with it and personally visited a couple of times as UNDP administrator. But I can only encourage you to keep trying to push those doors open.
Well, I think when it comes to institutions and systems, it's very important that we look at them beyond the government. Taliban are here today, but definitely they will not be there tomorrow. Even if they would be there, they're going to be like there with a different settlement. So I highly recommend that you continue your engagement, especially for maintenance of the system with the ministry. I'm sure you know that you have the technical team. They're still there to do it. And to be honest to you, we couldn't curb illegal mining because of the very complicated procedure that we have. And literally the complicated procedure that we had in place in Afghanistan actually fueled the illegal mining because we made it so difficult that I was telling sometimes my colleagues, I said, even if I would be in the private sector, I would be thinking of doing illegal mining than legal. Why we are making things so complicated, so difficult? So at least in case of Taliban, because they need the money, and they need quick revenue to generate. That's why they have expedited the process. They have oversimplified it, which is now jeopardizing the transparency as well. But nevertheless, I think the only way that we know what's happening in the sector is to provide continued support to the technical team so that they can keep the MCAS alive, the transparency portal, so we know how many contracts they have issued, with whom they have signed the contract, what are the productions, what is happening. I think that can help, that can give us a lot of information that can help us to analyze and see how they're operating. So that would be my advice. Of course, end of the day, that depends on how you would like to continue. I think profiling of the different actors, their interests, history of the country, on who has been in power and who has not been in power, because all societies and communities are having that history, is really important for us to understand what is going on, how we can bring balance. Because already in countries which have been in conflict, there are a lot of grievances within communities. And sometimes, but by not knowing who we are engaging with, we are adding up and we are increasing on those grievances. That's why I keep on insisting on the context. Secondly, in terms of civil society, look, end of the day, the job of civil society is the balance of power to basically have more scrutiny on the government, more pressure on the government, especially if they're autocratic and they're not open for inclusivity. So in terms of civil society, at least we need to see that which one are the vocal ones, that they stand for values. What very disappointingly I see keep on happening, that we are going in these kind of platforms and we are talking about transparency, accountability, civil society, and the important role that it can play in the whole process. But we also very practically see that when the donors are designing projects, they don't look at that. They say, okay, who can easily implement projects for me? Who can And like, they don't look at even background of the civil society organizations. For example, in case of Afghanistan, we had one group of civil society all the time fighting for women's rights, human rights, transparency, equality. But then we had a totally different group that they always had access to resources. And it was always a dilemma, and it was creating more fragmentation. So I think understanding, and as very rightly Helen said, in every sector you have reformers. In the most corrupt government, you will find some people that they are very clean. In the most clean civil society, you will find some civil society that they are doing very dodgy work. You also have private sector with both capacity. So for us, it's very important that we have the right partners at the national level, that they can help us to do the mapping and to identify that, okay, who are our partners, who are the reformers, how we can collaborate with them to strengthen them, and then they can help us with implementation of these benchmarks.
Well, we have to draw things to a close in terms of this very interesting discussion. I came to this feeling a little gloomy, but I leave feeling with a ray of hope. We've had a lot of conversation about lesson learning, about the importance of supporting reformers, keep preserving civil society space, and recognizing there can be an institutional legacy, even in as difficult environment as Taliban-run Afghanistan. Short-lived may it be. So many thanks for all those insights to the two of you. But I also do want to thank our hosts, both Norad and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for hosting this event and being the host for the EITI here in Norway for 15 years. And it is worth noting that 12 of Norway's bilateral partners are the EITI countries. So clearly this remains a very important area of concern that we share going forward. So let's express our gratitude to the panel and to our hosts. Many thanks.